Dozens of Alachua County residents showed up for several hours of debate regarding the future of the superintendent of schools.
Alachua County School Board members voted to keep the superintendent until the end of his contract. TV 20's Lali Salachi joins us live in the studio to tell us where they are heading.
Alachua County members voted unanimously to keep Shane Andrew as superintendent until the end of his contract and begin the search for a new superintendent until January of 2024. Dozens of parents took part in the Alachua County School Board meeting to show their support for Superintendent Andrew after school members shared their evaluation of his performance. Board members initially voted to start a new superintendent by November 30th. I spoke with member Tina Certain, who says student achievement, rezoning, and strategic planning are some of the goals that Andrew lacks focus on.
I brought forth the superintendent's name for him. He's in this position because I valued his experience with the district, his work experience with the district, but he was hired on to be our interim superintendent until the new board came to do a superintendent search.
However, several residents shared their concerns at the podium, saying Andrew should stay in his position because he is a strong leader and maintains stability in the district.
This man has shown his dedication to the children. He needs to have more time in order to put some of his plan in place. With the problems that we have in the school, it can't be expected to be fixed overnight.
Alachua County schools have had 7 superintendents, including interims, throughout the last 10 years. Superintendent Andrew argued he needs more time to put plans in place. After hours of discussion and resident input, the board unanimously agreed to accept their evaluations of Superintendent Andrew, which were mixed about his work. In the studios at Lali Salachi, TV 20 News.